pleasure to welcome you to this lecture that I've entitled Splendors of 30 Centuries. And this exhibit or this lecture is inspired in a great exhibit that Mexico created 30 years ago. It started in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And then it went to San Antonio and Dallas, and it ended up in Mexico. And the idea was to unite in a single space 3,000 years of culture. And I remember that at the time I was working in the Embassy of Mexico in the cultural section. And my boss was Ministro Pablo Marentes, that is with us this evening. And so there was a tour that the Smithsonian Museum was organizing from Washington, D.C. to New York. And so the people of the Smithsonian wanted somebody to do a little introduction when people got into the bus, and then accompanied the group to the exhibit. And so I was given this commission, and I took it very seriously. I actually read several times the 700-page catalog. I studied everything, and I designed my talk as a way that I could put the context of the objects and artwork that were displayed in this exhibit. So I was ready. And when the bus started, I started talking, and I was able to get a bus that had many screens that I illustrated with videos. And so I started talking when the bus opened, and I finished when we were entering into the parking lot of the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So it lasted more than 4 hours. And it was like nonstop. And basically that lecture started my career because I got good reviews from the audience, and the Smithsonian, said, started inviting me to do lectures. And after that, it got around that I was doing presentations, and so I started doing one and another. And eventually, I've dedicated myself completely to this activity. So the presentation that you will see today is very emotional for me because it means that I'm going back to where I started, back to the moment in which I found my career. And I never thought that that would be the case. I never proposed the idea of becoming a lecturer, that it was not even a career that existed, probably doesn't even exist now. It's the idea that the lecture itself can be a work of art, that the goal is the lecture. Because there's many people that give lectures, many writers that have books and present them, but their lectures are never an end in itself. They're always either teaching a class or they're promoting a book. But in my case, the goal is the lecture. And so in some ways, my presentation goes beyond 30 centuries of splendor because that exhibit ends in Tamayo. And what I wanted to do was to be as complete as possible. And so that is why I have done it in 2 sessions, today and next Saturday. So I welcome you all. And I still believe in this exhibit and the ideas behind it. If you notice an observation that Octavio Paz made, it is not, the title of this exhibit is not 30 Centuries of Splendor. That is the way people speak of Versailles, the splendor of the king. That is not the case here. Son los esplendores de 30 siglos. O sea, no son 30 siglos de esplendor. Son splendors of 30 centuries. Each work of art is a splendor. Cada obra de arte es un esplendor. So I think the idea is very beautiful. And this exhibit has been the most ambitious Mexico has ever created. And I think that it was very important in that it changed the perception of Mexico. At the time, Mexico was negotiating the free trade agreement, and it was very important to present a positive image of the country. And this exhibit and many others that occurred, at the time you walked in Manhattan and you could see Mexico's greatest cultural expressions there. It was fantastic. And then there was a whole network of Mexican cultural institutes all over the US that were created as nonprofit institutions. So they also allowed for the participation not only of Mexican nationals, but also of people in this country that love Mexican art in Mexico. So I still believe that culture is the best ambassador of a country. It is the best way of reaching common ground. It is the true way of revealing who you are. So for you, my dear friends, this re-encounter with a seminal presentation for me, a lecture that started everything, Splendors of 30 Centuries. So to travel through Mexico is to encounter every climate, every geography. It has from, the beautiful beaches of the Caribbean, of the Atlantic, of the Pacific, to the valleys and the high mountaintops, from the deserts to the woods and the jungles. Now, even richer than Mexico's geography is Mexico's culture. And one of the most extraordinary things of this exhibit was the introductory essay of Octavio Paz, The Will for Form, in which he says how the will for form is the will for life, and how childhood and youth are the promise of form. Maturity is the splendor of form. Old age is the decay of form. And death is the falling into formlessness. And so, therefore, behind every sculpture, every poem, every painting, what you're really looking at is the desire of people to create a form that will survive time and its ravages. A present that will survive death, that will live on to the future. And so when you look at the art of a country, what you're really looking at is the will of those people to live, to create a form that will survive time and its ravages. And so what we have in Mexico, there are certainly other great antique cultures. You find it in the Greek masterpieces, in the Egyptians, and so many. But what is remarkable about Mexico is that you have certainly the great masterpieces of the past, but you have a continuous process of creation. A will that recreates again and again. And some of the oldest expressions of that art, we find it in the Olmec civilization, a civilization that we know little about, that existed in the regions that are now the states of Tabasco, no, and Veracruz, and that left us, among many other creations, these gigantic heads. It is still a mystery how they transported these giant, heavy monoliths. And there's been many speculations about who they are. At first, some believed that they were African features. Now it has been established that they are, as the rest of the population of ancient Mexico, of Asian descent. And some even wondered about those helmets, and there's all kinds of speculations. Now we think that they are portraits of kings. And yet their magnificence, their force is something that is an example of a stone that has become fully alive, fully energetic. But the art of ancient Mexico is endlessly varied. And it goes from the monumental Olmec heads to the tiny figures of Colima that are among the only figures we know in the ancient world that are actually smiling. There are very few examples of joy and smiles in ancient art. Think of it. I don't think you've seen too many smiling Egyptian sculptures or even Greek. And yet these figures capture the smile. And it is said that smile is a human characteristic, that we are the only animals that can smile. It's certainly debatable, but now the historical and the anthropological interest in all these ancient creations of Mexico has often led us to study them entirely from an anthropological viewpoint. In this regard, I prefer the approach of Diego Rivera, who created a great museum, the Anahuacalli. And in this museum, he displayed the ancient art of Mexico in a similar way that we display other works of art. Let me show you two other creations of ancient Mexico that have continued to inspire artists till to this day. The Atlantes, again, these gigantic figures, enigmatic, and the Chacmoles. So here again, the anthropologists speculate if they were used to place human sacrificed hearts, etc. But the simplicity, the perfection of it is such that these forms are still felt. When you look at the work of contemporary artists like Henry Moore, you can clearly see the influence of ancient Mexico. As we can also appreciate the power of those constructions, those pyramids that are not just an architecture creation, but also a statement of time. The more we study them, the more we find that the way they are oriented, the amount of steps that they have, the way they are built, all are connected to a cosmology, to a conversation with time. And maybe perhaps that would be one of the first great differences of Mexican art with European art. And that is that in most cases in European art, what you see is artists that are trying to become independent from nature. Whereas the Mesoamerican believe in integrating him or herself with nature. Exactly the opposite. And this is seen in the architecture and in the figures, in the paintings. One of the forms of artistic expression of ancient Mexico that has survived the least is painting. It is believed that most of these pyramids were completely painted. And we have found fragments of murals in Teotihuacan. But here is a speculation of how those original pyramids must have looked like when they were created, so that everything was also a visual image. And the creations of the Mesoamerican world are not limited to a particular group. You have the great creations of the Olmecs, the Teotihuacanos, the Mayas, the Zapotecs. The Mayas are among the most distinguished. And they believed so much in aesthetics that they even modified their bodies. When people were very young, they put like tables, wooden tables in their forehead so that the line of the cranium would be different and would work in a more harmonious way with the line of the nose. And their constructions, I mean, this pyramid of Chichen Itza is so precise that on the equinox, it projects a given shadow. Can you imagine what you need to know of not only architecture, but of how the celestial bodies move to be able to design a building that projects a given shadow on a given day every year? Some of the murals of ancient Mexico have survived. Very importantly, those that we have in the Mayan region, in Bonampak. And among other things, these murals are not just a depiction of the rituals and the society, but also one of the greatest celebrations of music that has ever been painted. There are also very beautiful murals in Cacaxtla. Now, in the the center of Mexico, the dominating culture were the Aztecs. And the Aztecs are the latest to arrive to the Valley of Mexico. And they had been pursuing a sign. They came from a mythic region they called Aztlan. Nobody really knows where that is. But the idea was that wherever they found an eagle perched on a cactus and killing a snake, there they should establish their city. And so they find this signal that is now at the center of the Mexican flag, in the Valley of Mexico, but it's in a lake, it's water. And so the Aztecs create a city on the water. The extraordinary thing about Tenochtitlan, later become Mexico City, is that it is a floating city. You know, with this system of, putting, so when the Spaniards first saw But more than Venice, Bernal de Díaz del Castillo says it was like magic. It was like reading the fantastic tales of El Amadís. And all these different civilizations had basically two ways of relating to each other. One was trade that was very extended, and the other was war. But there is a significant difference between war in Europe and war in Mesoamerica, because the object of war was not the establishment of a plurinational empire like the Romans. Rather, the goal of war was to obtain tributes, but more importantly, prisoners for the practice of human sacrifice. And I want to pause a bit to talk about the practice of human sacrifice, because this is an aspect that has been used very much to malign the ancient Mexico civilizations. Or you have those hideous movies like Apocalypto of Mel Gibson that presents the human sacrifice as a practice of cruelty, and degradation. No, the idea of sacrifice is that time was alive, and that to keep it moving, you needed to nourish time with blood. So there is a participation in the cosmos. And there is always, throughout all the art of ancient Mexico, the idea of duality. You see the representation in figures of life and death, of male and female, of night and day. This idea of duality is also extremely important. And since life and death are a single process, death is not seen with the horror of Europe, but as a complement, as a necessary companion of life. And so from ancient times in Mexico, there are recreations of skulls and even the use of skulls in the artwork, or their recreation in these walls of skulls that they called zompantes, right? And as Carlos Fuentes says, there's a big difference between gods in Europe and gods in Mesoamerica. Because if you look at the Greek gods or the Roman gods or the Viking gods, they're all like super powerful people with exceptional gifts. But Zeus or Apollo or Jupiter, they're all humanoids. They're all people. Now, the Aztec gods or the Mayan gods are not incarnations of people. They're completely different. Here you have the Coatlicue, one of the central goddesses of the Aztecs. And she is represented with this figure that has at the center a skull, and then this skirt of snakes. And you also have the representation of time. One of the most impressive is the Sunstone. It has also been thought of as a calendar, but it is more a recreation of the sun. And what is also remarkable, especially in Aztec sculpture, is that on the one hand, you have this extreme richness of form, of concentrated motives, But then you also have the purity and the simplicity of a sculpture like this one, of a caracol. Simple, perfect, and beautiful. Or this warrior that is an eagle warrior. Also the creation of feather work. Here is the famous headdress of Moctezuma that Mexico has been trying to get the Europeans to return for hundreds of years. And some of the deities of the Mesoamerican cultures have attributes that are a synthesis of opposites. The way, for example, that Quetzalcoatl is presented is a feathered snake that combines the attributes of a reptile and a bird. So we see a lot of this transformation of people and animals. We see the jaguar features, the bird features. Here is another representation of Quetzalcoatl. Now, another very important difference between Mesoamerican art and European art is that in Europe and in Asia, and even Africa, you have a constant clash of civilizations. You have the Mongols that come all the way to Europe. You have the Muslims that conquer Spain. You have Europeans that extend through Africa. So the Europeans have a concept of other civilizations, but the ancient Mexicans did not. They had never encountered somebody of a different civilization. They were all either variants of that civilization. Of course, there is a difference if you're a Mayan or an Aztec or a Zapotec, but it's the same civilization. So they had either people of their civilization or people that were barbaric from the north. But the only category that they had for otherness was the sacred. And so when the Spaniards arrive, the Aztecs have this terrible doubt that destroys them. They don't know if these are other people or if they are other gods. And to make matters even worse, the idea of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was that he had been originally a white bearded man, who had taught people many things. And then in his old age, had been tempted by the alcoholic drink of pulque, and had sinned and had been felt so ashamed that he had asked to be burned in green wood. And from this serpent emerged the feathered serpent from the sacrifice. And that he had left towards the Atlantic and had left in his trail a series of crosses. And so when Moctezuma, the Aztec emperor, is told that there's these white bearded men that have come to the Atlantic shores with crosses, and to make matters even worse, the year that they come, the Seacatl year, was exactly the year of the prediction of the return of Quetzalcoatl. And so, instead of fighting them, Moctezuma sends them gifts and asks them to return, which of course only increases the greed of the conquistadors. Now, it is important to say that Cortés is perhaps one of the most audacious men in history. He had only an army of 500 soldiers. And so even with the Aztecs had 100,000 warriors. So even with the gunpowder and the cannons, still it would have been impossible if had the Aztecs just set out to crush him. Even with the superior weapons, they would have crushed him. And Cortés understands this. And yet he is in this kind of rogue expedition. His expedition was supposedly just to explore. He did not have the orders to conquer. So when he arrives to Mexico, to the Veracruz, he establishes first a new city, La Villa Rica de la Veracruz. So he's independent from the Cuban governor. And then when his men begin to question why is he doing this and they are thinking of returning, one morning they find that all their ships have been destroyed. Can you imagine? This is why in Mexico, when you take a decision that is irreversible, you say that you have burned your ships. In other words, you've canceled your possibilities of retreat. So that's exactly what Cortés does. And so, as I said, he had powder, he had swords, he had horses that terrified the Aztec warriors because they thought it was a single being. And yet, Cortés's most important weapon is not the guns or the swords or the horses. His greatest weapon is a woman. If you look at this painting by Siqueiros, you see the central warrior, you see behind him a woman. La Malinche had been an Indian princess. It was a polyglot. She spoke several indigenous languages. And there was a priest, Jerónimo de Aguilar, that spoke Mayan. So at first, Cortés spoke in Spanish to Jerónimo de Aguilar. Jerónimo de Aguilar spoke in Mayan to La Malinche, and so forth. But eventually, La Malinche would learn to speak Spanish fluently. And she would become Cortés's lover, but more important, she would be his advisor, and she would become his interpreter. And so through La Malinche, Cortés understands the dynamics of the Mesoamerican world and is able to form allegiances with the enemies of the Aztecs. So at some point, Cortés's army is 90% indigenous. And he arrives to Mexico City, to Tenochtitlan. He kidnaps Moctezuma. And then after committing all kinds of atrocities, because at the same time that Cortés is fighting against the Aztecs, the Cuban governor is fighting Cortés, and he sends an expedition to submit him. And so Cortés goes to subdue that. And meanwhile, Pedro de Alvarado, that he leaves in charge of Mexico, commits all kinds of barbarous acts. So finally, the Aztecs get tired of Moctezuma. They kill him. And a new ruler, Cuitláhuac, does what the Aztecs probably should have done at the beginning, which is to confront the Aztecs, confront the Spaniards. And they inflicted disastrous defeat to the Spaniards. So much so that Cortés weeps. It's called La Noche Triste, the sad night. However, Cortés goes back to Tlaxcala, his main Indian ally, and he had kept some of the metal parts of the boats and his main boat maker. So he creates 13 new boats that are carried by the Indian allies through the mountains. Can you imagine what that must have looked like? All these boats navigating in the jungles. And with those, he lays siege on Tenochtitlan. And another weapon of the Europeans are the plagues, to which the ancient Mexicans have no defenses. So it is a terrible defeat of the Aztec Empire that was at the zenith of its powers when this occurs. The last Aztec king, Cuauhtémoc, is captured by Cortés, who tortures him by burning his feet, trying to know where the treasure of the Aztecs was buried. Now, at the same time that the military dimension of the conquest occurs, at the same time that you have these soldiers led by Cortés, you also have the Catholic missionaries. And the Catholic missionaries are very interested in converting the indigenous populations to Christianity, to Catholicism, because the Catholic Church had lost more than half of its members to the Protestants. So at the same time that the Spaniards literally built the Cathedral of Mexico on top of the great temple of the Aztecs. Here you see, with the same stones. There is a whole spiritual transformation. So you look at a rock like this, that must have been a sculpture of Quetzalcoatl that is now used to do baptisms. So you have the greatest evangelization effort in the history of humanity. And in addition to, the act of the barbarous acts of the conquistadores, you have extraordinary people like Bartolomé de las Casas, like Vasco de Quiroga, some of the most advanced minds that come to Mexico and do all these utopic dreams they couldn't do in Europe. Places like Michoacán are some of the real utopias. Places that to this day are established in a visionary way where money is less important than creation. Now, it is important to say that this is not just a conversion to Christianity as it is a conversion of Christianity. And let me give you an example. The Europeans were used to worship in closed spaces, but the Aztecs and the Mayas worshiped in the open skies. And so instead of forcing them to do something that was unnatural to them. What is developed in Mexico are the open chapels, las capillas abiertas. And many of the dances and the music that were done by the indigenous population are transformed and given a new meaning by the priests. And the most interesting transformation, because people ask, how is it possible that people that were so vehemently religious could in a matter of decades become so vehemently Catholic? And the explanation is that in the basis of the ancient Mexican beliefs were sacrifice. Well, Christianity is also based on sacrifice, the sublimated sacrifice of Jesus. And so if you look at the way that Jesus is represented in Mexican churches, it is much more realistic than its counterparts in other latitudes. But notice how from a cross, it's like almost like an abstraction. In the indigenous hands, it becomes something entirely different. And the baroque that flourishes in Mexico more than anywhere else is enriched by the ancient architecture of Mexico that is also baroque. The book style of the Mayans, for instance, this concentration of forms, or the repetition, the fear of the empty spaces that you see in many of the ancient creations, is now transformed in these chapels and churches, in the mastery of stone and in wood that is so rich and is so dense. I mean, you go to Tonancintla or to La Capilla del Rosario, it's almost like an hallucination. I feel very sad when, you ask if people, if they know Mexico, and they say, yes, I went to Cancun last year. I mean, I love Cancun, but all these central places like Puebla and Querétaro and Oaxaca that have this incredibly beautiful, powerful displays of creativity. Some have referred to it as an ultra baroque. Truly extraordinary. And the transformation of the indigenous civilization is expressed in many ways. For instance, this is a Christian image, but it's done with feathers. And even in the more formal Catholic paintings that you see in Andrés de la Concha or Luis Juarez, you can see how there is it is difficult to say how it is different from its European counterparts, but it is. Something about the warmth of the colors. Here you see Baltasar de Echave y Villa, or the perfection of a work like this one by Sebastian Lopez de Arteaga, where the chiaroscuro is perfect, the skin is perfect, but there's much more light than in similar works in Europe. And the intelligentsia, the Spanish born in this continent, people like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, like Sigüenza y Góngora, many of the Jesuits, start to see themselves as different from the Europeans. This, by the way, is another of the great Mexican artists, Miguel Cabrera. And how are they different? Well, they're different because their past is indigenous. In other words, these Europeans and the people of mixed heritage identify with the indigenous past of Mexico and begin to focus on those things that are unique to Mexico. One of the earliest representations of a type of work that only happens in Mexico, it's not European. Among other things, because this doesn't happen in Europe, it's all these fusion of races. We now call it diversity. The possibility of intermarriage of white and indigenous people, white and black people, black and Indian, mulatto, and all these many possibilities of creating human beings that come from all races and that come together in Mexico, which is not only a racial issue, but it is also a cultural issue. I mean, this is happening now in Europe and the US, but this is 500 years later. And this process of fusion is expressed as well in the multiple appropriations, because Mexico is used from the very beginning to blend the opposites, the Spanish, the indigenous, then the Asian that crosses. There is this whole galleon of Acapulco, or La Nao de China, that trades with the East and that crosses Mexico and then is sent to Europe. But in the middle, there's all this influence of Asian. And then there is things that are original from Mexico, the enormous richness of the land, the production of silver that enriches the entire European continent. Because from the gold and the silver that comes from Mexico, that is not only used in the Spanish courts, but also the British pirates and the Dutch pirates take part of that wealth. All of this wealth builds Europe. That is why it's so disappointing, when you hear people that say they have no depth with the nations of this hemisphere. And this richness of the land, this richness of the metals, this coming together of cultures, this constant borrowing, constant enriching, you see it in the cuisine, and you see it in the religion. From the Jesuits that see Quetzalcoatl as Santo Tomas, and as a prefiguration of Santo Tomas, to the appearance and the worshiping in Tepeyac, in a place where there was this Aztec goddess called Tenantzin. And there is an indigenous man, Juan Diego, to whom this virgin appears. So now, in all these things, Mexico is different from Spain. And for the first part of the colonial period, from the first part of the New Spain was treated more as a kingdom But with the arrival of los Borbones, the Bourbons in the crown of Spain, this starts to change. You have a new artistic value that disapproves of the Baroque. You have the neoclassic artists like Manuel Tolsá. You have, and then you have one of the most limited and foolish aristocracies. Francisco de Goya painted them here for you, and you can see their venality. And he could get away with a queen that cheated on the king, perverted, stupid people that begin to treat the New Spain, Mexico now, not as a kingdom as it had been before, but now as just a colony to be exploited. And Goya could get away with painting them like idiots because he gives them these extravagant dresses. But just look at their eyes. And so this aristocracy is so venal and so limited that it gets completely dominated by Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon Bonaparte installs in the crown of Spain his brother Joseph, which was an alcoholic. People referred to him as Pepe Botellas, Joe Bottles. And so suddenly you have all these people in what is now Mexico wondering why should they obey the drunken brother of Napoleon. And so there's this emergence of conversations between the different criollos. Criollos are the sons and daughters of Spaniards in Mexico. Mestizos are the mixture of the Spaniards and the indigenous. And so Miguel Hidalgo, is part of one of these groups. And so they get discovered. And in one of those moments of historical inspiration, without a single weapon, without anything, Hidalgo rings the bells of his church and calls for the independence of the country. And interestingly, his banner is precisely the Virgin of Guadalupe. This dark-skinned virgin that I mentioned before becomes, in a way, Mexico's first banner. This reconciliation of the Indian and the Christian worldviews. And it happens as a miner covers himself with a rock. And so he enters into the fortress of the Spaniards and he opens the Alhóndiga de Granadita. And with that, the insurgent armies are able to get to the outskirts of Mexico City. Sadly, Hidalgo may be betrayed by his own condition as a priest and his fear of, killing many people in a battle for the city, retreats. And that is used by the Spaniards to finally apprehend, kill him. And sadly, to all of Mexico's founding fathers, to the equivalent for us of George Washington, Jefferson, they are arrested and their heads are cut off and they are exhibited in cages in each corner of the Alhóndiga de Granaditas. This was the fortress that Hidalgo had blown up to obtain the weapons. The effort of Hidalgo is carried on by Morelos. Morelos is also a man of mixed heritage, but a visionary, a man that sees a democratic goal in his sentimientos a la nación. But sadly, once he creates this Congress, he also loses his mobility and is eventually also captured and executed. The interesting thing about the culmination of Mexico's independence is that it is the product not only of the allegiance of the last insurgent, Vicente Guerrero, but also of the revolutions in Spain. Spain had adopted a new constitution, a liberal worldview in Cádiz. And so the conservative Spaniards living in Mexico do not want these laws to apply to them. And so they choose one of their soldiers, the man who had arrested Morelos, Agustín de Iturbide, to consummate Mexico's independence. He forms an allegiance with Guerrero, but eventually he's killed, and Mexico enters into a period of tremendous chaos. We have more than 30 governments in 40 years. And one of the emerging figures is Antonio Lopez de Santana. So Santana loses the war between Mexico and the US, in which Mexico loses half of its territory. Finally, the republic is reestablished by Benito Juárez, who is the first indigenous president that we have. And Juárez confronts a second attempt at European intervention, who impose in Mexico a European prince, Maximilian. And then Maximilian is defeated. So that is the turbulent 19th century in Mexico that concludes with the victory of Porfirio Díaz. Porfirio Díaz had been part of the Liberal Party. He also comes from Oaxaca, like Juárez. But once in power, Porfirio Díaz transforms himself and adopts the mannerisms of a European ruler. And all of this is also reflected in the art. So when you look at the art of the 19th century, you see works like Jose Maria Estrada and others that is very much a replication of what is happening in Europe, with several important exceptions. Perhaps the greatest artist in the 19th century of Mexico is the landscape artist Jose Maria Velasco. And Jose Maria Velasco is able to understand and recreate the light of Mexico. So because he is working in the landscape, and he's looking at a country that is very different from Europe. His landscapes have a completely different feel and color that what is happening in Europe or even in the US in the Hudson School. So it is a return to Mexico by focusing on Mexico's geography. Another very important artist is Hermenegildo Bustos. And Bustos focuses on the face. This new Mexican, who are we? What is the people that inhabits Mexico? This new human being that is partly indigenous, partly European, part Black, that has a unique way of dressing, a unique way of being. So again, you have these artists that, whereas a lot of the artists of the establishment and that wanted to copy the French did it by looking at other paintings of the Europeans. But both in the case of Velasco and Bustos, the reality check happens, the uniqueness happens, the singularity happens, because they are looking at what is uniquely Mexican, either because it is the landscape or it is the people that inhabit it. There's some great sculptors. Jesus Contreras, that with this work, Malgré Tout, wins the gold medal in the International Fair of Paris in 1900s. Or Fidencio Nava, in this wonderful work called Après l'Orgie. I remember when I was a young cultural officer, and I went to this museum where this sculpture is called the National Museum of Mexican Art, El Munal. And I remember that at the time, the director was this kind of very rigid woman. And I was looking at this piece and I could not help sliding my hands over her. And I was doing that exactly when this lady came. And so I thought, if I react as if I were surprised, she's going to say, oh, I got you red-handed, right? So I just kept on caressing her. And I told her, this sculpture gives a new, it resists the way the ancient Romans examined sculptures, by touching it, because bad sculptors put wax. So you had to touch the sculpture to make sure that it didn't have any wax. That is where the term sincera, chinchera comes from. And so it saved my reputation. But you have this level of realism. These are kind of like the new discovery of something original. And then you have an artist that died in obscurity, Jose Guadalupe Posada, a popular artist, an engraver, a man who made these prints like La Catrina, this festive death that would inspire the work of Diego Rivera and many others. And again, who captures the popular mood in Mexico. So Porfirio Diaz governs the country for 30 long years. And it is indeed stable. There is some economic development, but there is this huge disparity of wealth. And the haciendas are places where the peons are held there for life, sometimes for generations, controlled with this system of company stores that sell on credit. and a ferocious repression of anybody that dares to protest. So Porfirio Diaz is getting ready to celebrate the centennial of Mexico. The independence happens in 1810, it begins in 1810, and now it's 1910. And there's a couple of strikes in Rio Blanco that are, again, repressed. And Porfirio Diaz is ready to celebrate the independence. They're doing all kinds of works, the column of the independence. And then he does an interview with a foreign correspondent, an American correspondent, James Creelman, in which he says that he believes Mexico is ready for democracy. This unleashes all kinds of speculation. And it is interesting to note that in some of the crucial parts of Mexican history, you have the presence of comets, both when the Spanish arrive in the independence and also in the revolution. And this man, Francisco I. Madero, who is part of the wealthy establishment, presents his candidacy, writes a book in which he criticizes re-election and not an honest vote. And Porfirio Diaz tries to repress this, but by now, as Diaz would say, the tiger is unleashed. And Porfirio Diaz retires to Europe. Madero wins, but cannot control the forces and the expectations that he has liberated. People that want land, that want, and he, instead of that, he surrounds himself with a lot of the former Porfirians and eventually is assassinated. His assassination opens the period of revolution again. The same way that in 1810, now in 1910, you have the beginning of a new revolution. A revolution that is fought all over the country, a revolution in which women participate, the soldaderas, with popular caudillos such as Pancho Villa, and the trains that had been built during the Porfirio Diaz regime are now the vehicle through which the revolution circulates all through the land. At one point, Villa attacks Columbus in the US. And there is this punitive expedition in which American troops look for him in vain in northern Mexico. And the other great figure is Emiliano Zapata. Emiliano Zapata, his aim is to redistribute the land among the peasants. Tierra y libertad, land and liberty is his claim. So we would need an entire presentation or more than that to go into the details of the Mexican Revolution. But for our purposes, and I have given you this historical background because it is indispensable to understand it so that you can see how it is transformed in the art that Mexico would create. There's a new constitution with Venustiano Carranza, but all these leaders of the revolution end up killing each other. Now, what is very interesting from a cultural perspective, from an artistic perspective, is that this new government and this new Minister of Education, Jose Vasconcelos, that does these campaigns of creating rural schools, of distributing millions of books on the backs of donkeys all over the land, of believes that art and education should be intertwined, and opens the possibility for artists to do public murals. So in our next presentation, we're going to talk about all these wonderful murals that would be created in Mexico. So in our next show, we will talk about the precursors of this revolution in art. We will talk about the emergence of these gigantic figures like Diego Rivera, Siqueiros, Orozco. And then we will also mention how the power of the muralists is such that they suck up all the oxygen. And so then you have the dissidents. And we will talk about Tamayo, that looks for different ways of being Mexican. But very interestingly, we will talk about very important women artists, some of them married to the muralists, that are creating intimate works. So whereas the muralists are looking at the history and at the outside, these women are looking towards themselves, such as the case of FRIDA KAHLO that we have talked about, but also of Maria Izquierdo that looks at her immediate environment, or artists such as Remedios Varo and Leonora Carrington that are interested in surrealism and the world of dreams. We will also talk about those artists that were overshadowed by the muralists. Artists like Rodriguez Lozano and Julio Castellanos and El Corcito. And we will mention the abstract artists of Mexico, Gunter Getzo, Mérida. And in the 60s, you have a group of young people, a movement that we call La Ruptura, with artists such as José Luis Cuevas, that attack the muralists and say that their vision of Mexico is different from the one of the muralists. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the great processes of decentralization of Mexican culture,